Now we're looking at how these individual differences matter. And of course, they matter in terms of the behavior and how we make decisions. Rooted in the conversation of class 3, whether we see ourselves as rational, as Homo economicus or not, we see increasing evidence that this model of rational decision-making is increasingly false and unhelpful. We're not maximizing. In fact, we're biased from the get-go. We're not able to maximize, and we don't even want to. We're not making rational decisions in many ways. In fact, I'm showing you this map here, and it's not important that you can all read it. We have identified more than 200 biases. Biases are those elements and decision-making mechanisms that clearly are not rational. And let me go through some of those. And those are just the more important ones. We call those decision traps. These are predictable, stable, heuristic processes that occur without our realizing that they're happening. We're making biased decisions, oftentimes when we think we're making rational decisions. And that's most dangerous, of course, when we are in a position of power, when you're under time pressure, when you're trying to multitask, or when you're stressed out or overly tired. If you recall, as I drew the generic version of the brain, the emotional piece that sits underneath that rational processing power is very strong. And if we don't have the time, don't have the energy, etc., to think through things very concretely, then we tend to make decisions that are very biased. What are those biases? One is called an escalation of commitment. People make decisions just because they have committed to a decision before. Warren Buffett says this in some way: when you find yourself in a hole, the best thing is stop digging. That doesn't mean that people keep digging. Addiction is one of those escalations of commitment. In the rational way, resources that we have committed should not have any bearing on future investments, right? The correct analysis of future benefits is that of future benefits to future costs. But when we have committed something in the past, we oftentimes feel bound to it and say, oh, you know what, I invested already so much money, so much time, I'm going to finish this degree, I'm going to finish doing this, even though I never want to work in that field and I know it already, etc. So these kind of things are witnessable in most human beings, and they're not rational in the traditional sense. They are a bias. They are what we call an escalation of commitment. Another trap is a status quo trap, a bias that we're like to stick with the current state of affairs. We don't like to go out and explore and break away from the status quo. The more choices, especially this happens, the more choices we are given, the more likely we are sticking with the status quo. Marketers know this, advertisers know this, financial planners know it. Basically, once we have decided on something, we'll stick with it. We're not going to go back, even if something else would be better. We're not rational in that sense either. Overconfidence is another and very popular kind of trap. It's an undue optimism, an inflated sense of knowledge and ability. People oftentimes tend to make decisions not knowing very many facts and underestimating their limits and the knowledge and insight that might be needed to make a good decision. We find, and research shows that whether the category is driving skills, looks, leadership potential, intelligence, charm, people typically rank themselves above average, usually considerably above. This effect is also called the Lake Wobegon effect. This is a popular show on NPR. Lake Wobegon is a village where all children are above average. Of course, you know that that is impossible, rationally impossible. But still, people do tend to be overconfident. A famous survey of drivers in the 80s asked people how would they rate themselves in terms of driving ability. And 80% of respondents rated themselves in the top 30% of all drivers. We could see this replicated, whether it's intelligence, as I said, charm. People consider themselves better than average students, more intelligent. And for example, professors, 94 professors said their own scholarship was better than the norm. So we are inherently overconfident in some way, and this can be hurting our decision making. Unless we create some kind of meta-knowledge, some understanding of where our insights are limited. Knowing what we know and knowing what we don't know. And then there's another way that was mentioned by Will Rogers, is that it's not what we don't know that gives us trouble, it's what we know, which ain't so. So we oftentimes think we know certain things, we're very confident about them, and they are just not true. They're not borne out by the facts. Still, people act with a lot of confidence based on these misconceptions. We're not very rational. One thing that we have to acknowledge is that overconfidence does increase with incompetence. Individuals whose intellectual and interpersonal abilities are weakest are those who most likely overestimate their performance and ability. There's an effect called the Kruger-Dunning effect. The less you know, the more self-inflated your the more inflated your self-assessments are. Experts, by contrast, see themselves a lot less knowledgeable. They understand that they don't know many things. So there's actually a test that you can do. If you ask people if they're an expert, the expert should be saying that really they don't know that much. Whereas the incompetent would be saying, yes, definitely. Calibration of competence is important, and how and where you can get that calibration is oftentimes by data, by trial and error, by doing things, by testing things. So the more competent you are, the more data you get, the more willing you are to adjust, builds more competence, okay? And this is, for example, the case for weather forecasters in some way, and others who constantly get feedback about their ability to predict in different ways. In terms of management and decision making, it's critical that good decision makers are open to getting calibrated, to testing assumptions, and then adjust those assumptions going forward. Overconfidence is very critical because it has detrimental consequences. We underestimate risk, we miss deadlines, we're overrun budgets, we don't ask for help when we need, or we simply think we're unbeatable. Hubris, oftentimes the cause of a downfall of a company and or of a person as well. Another bias that's very prevalent is called the confirmation bias. We look for information that supports our existing values, beliefs, desires, or past choices. We also discount information that contradicts those beliefs, values, or past choices. This is pretty relevant today in the internet age, with Google at our service and other kinds of mechanisms to basically get information. There are many examples of this confirmation bias in play that led to disastrous consequences. For example, the decision to go to war in Iraq. Confirmation bias is viewed through, for example, what we watch, where we get our information from. Is anybody watching both sides of the story, different sides? Most of the time, more liberal people will watch certain types of shows, and more conservative people will watch other shows. They rarely watch both together. If you want to handle the confirmation bias, you can. We know that you can ask disconfirming questions rather than leading questions. You can ask to be proven wrong. You want to get the real story. You ask in that way, you become an investigator. You're not trying to be an advocate for your own opinion. We're going to get to that more later, but this is very important for those that are interested in management. Other effects are primacy and recency effects. For example, if you're in an interview, who will an interviewer remember? It's typically the first person that they meet and the last person. Okay? And the people in between are just less memorable. The primacy effect is a reason why first impressions are so sticky. The recency effect is whatever happens last, no matter what it is, especially negative feelings, will influence the entire experience, even if it has been positive throughout. It has increasing weight. This feeds into the availability and recallability bias, which is any data that's available to you and recallable influences your decision making. Think about terror attacks, especially if they're rather recent, they're available. And what will people do? They'll avoid certain places. They will be scared. They will not go out of the house. They might not fly, etc., especially after a terror attack. It actually has been shown that the places are most safe when these attacks have happened. So it's not necessarily rational to not go there. But we as humans have other mechanisms, and we say, this is dangerous, we don't want to go there, especially if it happened recently. Another bias is an anchoring bias. We focus on things that we see, that we hear, on one value or idea, and then use that as a starting point for conversations. These simple anchors, for example, could be in real estate. A listing price is the starting point of the conversation. You can anchor it. Recommended prices are oftentimes put out because they start the conversation about what the real price is and what a cheap price is. So oftentimes you see in stores a sales, a reduction, something like that, to anchor it at a very high price and then say it's so cheap now because you get all this reduction. We have these anchors all the time. The salary of our last job could be an anchor. The initial cost estimates of a project could be another one, etc., etc. You will read more about this in a moment. And a final effect that shows how irrational we actually are is that framing effects occur. The way we speak with each other frames a conversation, allows us to see certain things differently. And advertisers know this very well. They give you a certain frame about a certain product, and most of the time when they're successful, we're more likely to buy this product than any other product, even if we didn't want that to begin with. One of the framing effects that is operating very clearly is that gains, we are risk averse for gains and ensure gains, and we risk to avoid losses, etc. And here's an example. For example, the IRS. You come home from work and find a letter from the IRS, the tax agency that we all don't like, and seems there's a discrepancy in your last tax return, and the government is claiming you owe penalties of $10,000. You check with a tax lawyer, and he suggests that you could contest it in court. If you take it to court and win, your lawyer thinks you have a 15% chance of winning. You will owe nothing. 0. 15%. However, if you take it to court and lose, your lawyer thinks you have an 85% chance of losing. You will owe additional expenses totaling $12,500. What would you do? A, pay the $10,000 now, $10,000 loss, or B, go to court with an 85% chance of paying more, $12,500, and a 15% chance of paying nothing. Is it A or B? Most people choose B because a $10,000 loss now seems to be worse than paying $12,500 later, which is most likely. Let's see a different scenario. You come home from work and find the letter from the IRS we all dream of. It seems there's discrepancy in your last tax return and the government owes you $10,000. You check with a tax lawyer and he suggests that you may have more owed to you. If you contest it and you win and the lawyer thinks you have an 85% chance of winning, you will come away with $12,500. However, if you take it to court and lose, your lawyer thinks you have 15% chance of losing, you will come away with nothing. What do you do? A, take the $10,000 now as a gain, or B, go to court with an 85% chance getting $12,500 and a 15% chance of getting nothing. What would you take? Most people choose A. If you notice, the scenario is very similar. It's just one is framed around gains and one is framed around losses. And we choose differently. These framing effects have critical effects in business life, in all kinds of lives. We are evaluating risk with a bias. Could be a last trade that we made that was either a good one or a bad one. It was how the S&P 500 does at this point. It's how peer performance is. If it's bad, we sort of use that as a reference point. We have a bonus threshold, etc., etc. We use and are prone to be affected by framing effects most of the time. And our decisions are impacted by that. When the stock market is doing poorly, we will probably not invest. Maybe it's the best time to invest, but we will not because we have all these framing effects of a stock market going down. If our last trade was bad, we will say, oh my God, maybe I will not invest now. If my last trade was good, I'm much more likely to invest now. These framing effects play a large role in our decision making, as do the other effects. And they just simply show we're not that rational. And it's important for us to understand that to be good managers.